Vladimir Putin has many enemies, but those who oppose Putin lead extremely dangerous lives themselves. Although Putin is officially the elected president of the Russian Federation and not a dictator, it is remarkable that some well-known people who oppose Putin are losing their lives remarkably often under mysterious circumstances. They fall from great heights, swallow poisons, or disappear as if from nowhere. Today, we want to show you exactly these cases and the methods that have been used to eliminate Putin's enemies. Let us start with the case of Boris Nemtsov, a 55-year-old politician who was an excellent friend of Putin for many years. Later, however, he turned his back on him, switched to the political opposition, and even became one of the president's harshest critics. Among other things, he called Russia a mafia state and Putin a mafia boss. Moreover, even before the invasion of Crimea, he warned against Putin and said publicly that no compromises should be made with him. In February 2015, he said in an interview that Putin was very dangerous. A tragic event then occurred just 4 days later, when the politician went for an evening walk with his girlfriend on a bridge within sight of the Kremlin. He wanted to surprise her with a romantic dinner. Instead, he was shot 4 times in the back of his head on the street in front of his partner's eyes. Putin himself publicly expressed his disgust at the case, and subsequently, 5 Chechen-alleged perpetrators were arrested and sentenced to long prison terms. They allegedly carried out the crime on behalf of an unknown client. However, the client and the motives were never identified. If you are critical of the Russian president, you obviously should not stay near windows. After all, you could accidentally fall through them. That's what happened to Pavlo Anof, a Russian oligarch who became wealthy as a sausage maker. Anof was also active in politics and was considered very powerful. In 2022, he made a fatal mistake. He wrote on WhatsApp in a message that the war in Ukraine was terrorism. When the public found out, he immediately retracted his words and apologized. But by then, it was too late. A short time later, he flew to India on holiday to stay in a suite on the 3rd floor of a luxury hotel and celebrate his birthday. There, however, he fell out of the window of his hotel room and died on the spot. Pavlo Anof was not alone in the hotel. He was traveling with another businessman friend who was also a critic of Putin. This businessman friend had died a few days earlier in the same hotel. According to media reports, however, he had suffered a heart attack. The deaths of the 2 men could not be examined more closely, as their bodies were quickly cremated. Ral Magomedov, president of a Russian oil company, also appears to have had bad luck with a window last year. Indeed, the businessman who publicly condemned the invasion of Ukraine fell from the 6th floor of a hospital in Moscow in September 2022. There have subsequently been contradictory statements in the Russian media about the fall. While some claimed an accident, others pointed to suicide as the cause of death. And high-ranking official Marina Jenina, who worked for the Russian Defense Ministry, also fatally fell from a high floor of the building this year. This fall from the window was also officially classified as an accident by Russia. But not every public enemy of Putin's has to pass away. Russian anti-corruption activist and opposition politician Alexei Navalny survived an attack by Putin 3 years ago. In 2020, he was sitting on a plane bound for Moscow when he suddenly collapsed and then fell into a coma. According to multiple media reports, Navalny was allegedly poisoned with a powerful nerve agent that Russian intelligence secretly planted in his pants. Navalny, who survived the attack through rapid treatment, even later released a recording of a telephone conversation with a suspected intelligence agent in which he admits to the poison attack. The Russian government, however, denied everything and refused to investigate. Alexei Navalny is currently in prison on various flimsy charges and faces 19 years in jail if his trial is held soon. Journalists who do not report according to the government's interests also live dangerously in Russia. In the country, which is ranked 150th out of 180 in terms of press freedom, a visibly large number of critical journalists are dying. One example is Natalia Estemirova, a journalist who campaigned for human rights. The former teacher repeatedly denounced injustices and human rights violations, and when she got into the elevator of her apartment building in 2009, Estemirova was kidnapped and found lifeless in a wooded area with several bullet holes in her body that same day. Her death caused a major public reaction, and Vladimir Putin himself announced that the murder would be thoroughly investigated. But since absolutely nothing happened, the Russian president said at the time that it was now known who the perpetrator was and that everything was being done to catch him. But in fact, there has been no result of the investigation to date. Her colleague Anastasia, who wrote for an opposition newspaper, and her friend lawyer Stanislav Markelov, who often represented critical journalists in court, were also shot in the middle of the street in Moscow the same year, and these murders also remained unsolved. Let us now turn to Alexander Litvinenko, who worked for the Russian Secret Service and later defected to the British Secret Service as an informer. The latter had tea with two Russian businessmen in 2006. 3 weeks later, he died in hospital, and it was discovered that Litvinenko had been poisoned with polonium. In other words, he had been served radioactive tea, which led to his agonizing death. A British investigation report concluded that the Russian government was behind the murder. It makes sense that the state was indeed involved since polonium can only be produced in a nuclear reactor, to which ordinary citizens are not known to have access. The Russian businessman and whistleblower Alexander Preshnikov, who leaked secret documents to the Swiss authorities and thus uncovered a massive money laundering scandal by the Russian government, was also poisoned. After fleeing to England following his revelations, he was found dead in his apartment with plant poison residue in his stomach. Finally, let us turn to the case of the Russian oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin. For a long time, he was on excellent terms with Vladimir Putin and started out as the president's personal chef. Over time, he also became increasingly influential in the business world and even created his own private army called the Wagner Group. He sent this army to various wars, and through his good relationship with Putin, the so-called Wagner Army Group also helped the Russians in Ukraine. Even after the war in Ukraine started, the relationship between the two men was initially excellent, but then everything slowly changed for the worse. Prigozhin complained privately to Putin that Wagner's group was not receiving enough support from the Russian president and needed help. But that help did not come, and Prigozhin made a severe mistake. He published his criticism and insulted Putin and other Russian generals on cell phone videos. His criticism turned into outright hatred, and a few months ago, he declared that he would now even march his army to Moscow and oppose the Russian government. His enemy was no longer Ukraine but Putin. It was a momentous mistake, as it turned out shortly afterward. Initially, Team Wagner and Prigozhin accepted the offer that they would get away with it, and that Prigozhin could live in exile. But when Prigozhin flew from Moscow to St. Petersburg in his private jet shortly afterward, there were not only 9 other people with him, but also an explosive device. Only about 20 minutes after takeoff, this explosive device exploded, and the plane immediately fell to the ground. It is not yet clear who was responsible for the attack. Not only Prigozhin, but 38 other Russian businessmen who were critical of the government have died mysteriously in recent years.